Welcome to this explainer. Let's travel back to the late 1960s for a second. The Cold War is at its absolute peak, and the US and the Soviet Union are locked in an incredibly tense, high-stakes battle for global supremacy. Now, the Soviets had already made a massive splash in space, with the Sputnik satellite and putting the very first astronaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit. In response, America set a ridiculously hurried and ambitious goal to be the first superpower to plant a flag on the moon. Getting the Apollo 11 astronauts there in July of 1969 required an unbelievable array of innovative high-end technology. We're talking the world's biggest rocket, the absolute smallest computers of the time, and the very first high-speed data network. Without a doubt, it was the most visionary project in human history. But that brings up a really fascinating question, right? How exactly did 1960s America manufacture the future? Well, the central paradox of our explainer today is this. While the technology dreamed up for the Apollo missions was incredibly visionary, our automated manufacturing capabilities severely lagged behind our imaginations. We just didn't have the automated factories to actually build what our engineers could dream up. And what that meant is that a surprising number of the spacecraft's most critical, cutting-edge parts literally couldn't be built by machines. Instead, they had to be painstakingly crafted and assembled by hand. Section 1. The Apollo Manufacturing Paradox. President John F. Kennedy desperately wanted America to reestablish its reputation for leadership in science, technology, and engineering. And that geopolitical urgency meant that manufacturing difficulties simply couldn't slow anyone down. Basically, if a machine couldn't build it, human hands were going to have to do it. There was just this stark contrast between our ambitions and our capabilities. We had this fantastical, futuristic requirement to safely land humans on the lunar surface, directly juxtaposed with the incredibly mundane reality of how we actually had to get them there. Because our manufacturing reality was totally stuck in the 1960s, the Apollo mission had to rely on a vast, little-known, and really unheralded battalion of blue-collar workers back on Earth. It was sheer, manual, human ingenuity that made this fantastical voyage possible. Section 2. Sewing the Lunar Spacesuits. Let's take a look at one of the most vital components of the entire mission. The astronauts required a suit that was a true high-tech marvel. Think about it. It needed to be tough enough to stop a micrometeorite traveling through the dead vacuum of space, yet flexible enough to allow the astronauts to actually move around and do the work they needed to do on the lunar surface. To solve this massive problem, NASA turned to a totally unexpected partner. The Apollo spacesuits were actually crafted by Playtex. Yeah, exactly. The exact same company that gave America the famous Cross Your Heart bra in the 1960s. Playtex actually won the NASA contract with the rather cheeky observation that they were already very familiar with creating garments that had to be both form-fitting and flexible. They ended up adapting materials directly from the fabrics they used in their bras and girdles. But because the assembly was considered such delicate and utterly critical work, it relied entirely on the women brought over from Playtex's consumer product division to do the hand sewing. The secret to that flexibility and strength came down to one staggering number: 21. There were 21 individual layers of nested fabric in those suits. Every single layer had to be flawlessly sewn together by hand by these women. Every stitch had to be absolutely perfect, because if they made even a tiny mistake, the spacesuit wouldn't perform correctly, and in the unforgiving environment of the moon, that meant the very literal difference between life and death for the astronauts. But as it turns out, spacesuits weren't the only critical fabric that required an immense manual effort. The massive parachutes needed for splashdown were equally demanding. These things had to slow the plunge of a heavy capsule falling at 160 miles per hour and float it gently into the Pacific Ocean. Each of the three main parachutes was 83.5 feet across, which is enough fabric to cover the floor space of 3 typical U.S. homes. To hold this incredibly strong, lightweight fabric together, it required 2 million individual stitches, using 3.5 miles of thread. And absolutely every single seam was run through Black Singer sewing machines by hand and then painstakingly inspected on a light table for flaws. Once those flawless parachutes were finally sewn, they had to be packed. And during the Apollo missions, only 3 people in the entire country were trained and licensed by the Federal Aviation Administration to fold these specific parachutes by hand: Norma Creedle, Buzz Corey, and Jimmy Kalunga. These 3 handled all 11 Apollo missions. Their handiwork was considered so utterly critical to the survival of the astronauts that NASA literally forbade them from ever riding in the same car together. They simply couldn't risk a single catastrophic accident wiping out their entire parachute packing team. Section 3. Woven Tires and Rope Memory. Okay, let's explore how human hands literally wove together two of the most revolutionary mechanical components of the Apollo missions. First up, the lunar rover. The astronauts absolutely loved zooming across the hilly, dune-like lunar surface in these electric cars, but the wheels posed a massive engineering challenge. How do you get traction without getting completely mired in the very fine, incredibly abrasive lunar dirt? The tire maker Goodyear solved this, but it required an intense manual effort. Each tire was made of a woven wire mesh that would flex open to let the dirt drop out and then immediately return to its shape. To build this dense mesh, it required 3,000 feet of zinc-coated piano wire per tire. And yes, all 3,000 feet of that piano wire was meticulously hand-cut and hand-woven on a specially designed loom. And then we have the computers. In the 1960s, a typical small computer was about the size of 3 refrigerators lined up next to each other. It used slow punch cards, and it took hours just to return basic results. But the MIT-designed Apollo flight computer? It was the size of a briefcase, used a keyboard, and worked instantly. It was an absolute marvel, the very first computer of significance to actually use integrated circuits and computer chips. But while the design was light years ahead of its time, manufacturing was in its absolute infancy. To save precious weight and space, they used something called core rope memory, which was the densest computer memory available at the time. But it had one massive catch. It had to be made entirely by hand. Former female textile workers at a Raytheon factory in Massachusetts literally wove the computer software into hardware. Using just a needle and wire, they created the code. If they threaded the wire through the center of a tiny ring-shaped magnet, it represented a 1. If they threaded the wire to the outside of that magnet, it was a 0. Just consider the staggering scale of this task for a second. 589,824. That is the number of ones and zeros of computer programming that had to be positioned with absolute precision by hand. Every single wire had to be exactly correct, or the incredibly sophisticated flight program would fail. It took these highly skilled women 8 full weeks of tedious, exacting work just to weave the memory for a single 73-kilobyte flight computer. For Apollo, the software was, quite literally, hardware woven by human hands. Section 4. Surviving the fiery return. Coming home from the moon wasn't exactly a gentle glide. The command module hit the Earth's atmosphere traveling at a blistering 25,000 miles per hour. This crazy friction generated temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The terrifying problem here is that 5,000 degrees is hot enough to literally vaporize the metal of the capsule, and obviously the astronauts inside. To solve this, a Massachusetts company named Avco developed an all-new material. It was a custom resin designed to act as a heat shield. As the capsule plummeted through the atmosphere, this surface resin would gradually burn away, which safely dissipated the extreme heat of re-entry. But fastening this incredible new material to the curved spaceship was an immense physical challenge. Engineers developed a honeycomb framework to hold the resin, and the thickness of this framework had to vary at every single point along the capsule's curves to provide exactly the right amount of protection. This honeycomb consisted of 370,000 individual cells, and in the late 1960s, there was only one way to fill those 370,000 cells properly. By hand, one cell at a time. Avco employed staff, again, mostly women, who came to be known as gunners. They earned this awesome nickname because they used slightly modified caulk guns to physically pump the resin into every single one of those 370,000 cells. This work was so delicate and so critical that every gunner had to undergo 2 straight weeks of training before they were ever even allowed to touch a real capsule. And to ensure absolute perfection, the finished sections were meticulously x-rayed just to guarantee that every last cell had been properly filled by these gunners. Section 5. The hands behind Apollo. The technology that got us to the moon is rightfully celebrated as a massive triumph of engineering, physics, and computing. But none of it, literally none of it, would have left the launch pad without the immense, highly skilled manual labor of everyday people. And just how skilled was this manual labor? Well, there's a fantastic anecdote from a brief strike in the mid-1960s at the Raytheon factory where the computer memory was woven. While the female workers were out on strike, managers and supervisors sat down and tried to keep the Apollo computer assembly line going by doing the weaving themselves. As Ed Blondin, a senior manager at the facility, bluntly put it, everything they made was scrap. It was a powerful reminder that this tedious work demanded real experience and totally irreplaceable skill. So this explainer reveals a really beautiful paradox. The most fantastical, futuristic voyage in human history,
The mission that allowed humanity to leave our home planet and actually walk on the moon was ultimately powered by consumer techniques, adapted caulk guns, and blue-collar ingenuity. It was the Playtex seamstresses, the Raytheon memory weavers, the Avco resin gunners, and those 3 licensed FAA parachute packers who truly put Apollo 11 on the moon.
Today, as our technology advances at absolute light speed, our manufacturing is fully automated, heavily driven by robotics and AI. But looking back at the staggering manual achievements of the 1960s leaves us with a lingering thought. As we build new spacecraft and look toward Mars, will we ever again rely so heavily on the human hand to reach the stars? Thank you so much for exploring this remarkable history with me.